Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
I'm with Sonia Shah, author of the book, The Next Great Migration, The Story of Movement in a Changing Planet. Sonia, welcome to ThePrint.
Thanks for having me.
So you're far away in Baltimore in the US. I'm in my offices of ThePrint here in New Delhi. And I don't have a physical copy of the book because I was told that during the lockdown none were printed, but perhaps you can show me yours.
Absolutely. I'd be happy to. Here it is.
Fantastic. That looks so beautiful, and we look forward to seeing this in bookstores in Delhi. And the footprint is so evocative. And I suppose that's the story of not just men on the move, but, you know, checker spot butterflies that you start with. So tell us about your book. Tell us first about a little bit about the book.
Well, so I'm a science journalist, and I've been writing about infectious diseases and contagions, the history of disease for many years. After I wrote my last book, which was called Pandemic, that came out in 2016, I went to Greece to start reporting on what was called the migrant crisis there. This was when people were leaving Syria and Afghanistan, you know, in large numbers, and they're trying to get into Europe. And they're getting stuck in the Mediterranean Sea, and there's drownings, and then there's detention camps, and it was just all over the headlines. And so I went there to, because I thought, well, this could be a public health hazard. You know, these are people who are leaving countries that have no vaccination campaigns because, you know, they've collapsed societies. They're under a lot of stress. They're moving into places with, you know, totally different disease environment, and that this could be, you know, this could seed outbreaks.
Yeah.
So I went to Greece to report on that, and I was talking to a physician from Doctors Without Borders, and I can't remember exactly what I said. I said something about, oh, the migrant crisis is having this effect or that effect or something like that, and he said, there is no migrant crisis. And I was like, well, but there's the people dying. There's all, you know, all this tumult is happening. What are you talking about? And he said, well, you know, there's plenty of capacity in Greece to absorb these people. There's plenty of jobs. It's life-saving for these people to actually move, and it might even contribute to the resilience of the societies they left behind that they have moved. So the crisis is not the migration. He said the crisis is of welcome. You know, it's a hospitality crisis, essentially. And I realized then that I had really reflexively conflated any kind of movement with catastrophe, and that was actually not just me. Like, that is something that we all kind of do reflexively, is if people are moving, it's, you know, it's a migrant crisis. It's sort of, we don't think about, is there room for them? Is it life-saving for them? Is it better for the societies they enter? Is it better for the societies they leave behind? Those are all the questions we'd want to answer if we really, you know, if we're really examining the issue about a particular migrant flow. But we don't do that. We just automatically assume it's a crisis. And so what I wanted to do in this book is really interrogate, where does that conflation come from? Why do we think of migration automatically as a crisis?
Right. So, you know, your name is Sonia Shah. You're clearly of Indian origin, and you write about it also in some, you know, the early pages of the book, and how your parents came to the US, your mother wearing in a sari and chappals with her socks bunched around her toes. I thought that was really beautifully put. But the story of the migration of say, not just human beings from one part of the world or the universe to another, but of animals, of the checker spot butterfly that you talk about and that you begin your book with. So what's the story of this migration of animals or the animal kingdom?
Well, we're seeing right now, we're seeing about 80% of wild species are moving. They're shifting their ranges into the heights, you know, higher into the mountains and towards the poles. And they're trying to sort of find new habitats where the climate is more amenable, where they can survive. And so biologists widely understand this as life-saving for these creatures, right? If we want to conserve biodiversity, we have to make sure that these creatures can move. So there's a whole new idea in conservation that instead of building parks with borders around them to protect animals, what we really should be doing is building bridges and corridors so that they can move into new places. And so we're really seeing this scrambling of migration patterns around the world. It's happening with wild species. It's also happening with people, where we have, you know, more people living outside of their countries of birth today than at any time in the past.
So are you saying that you're not concerned really about wild species, say fish going deeper and deeper into the ocean, or just animals moving northwards or southwards, towards the poles? And if this is so this climate change, does that concern you?
I mean, the climate crisis is a true catastrophe. It's a slow motion catastrophe of our own making. Absolutely. And we need to do whatever we can to arrest, the intensification of the climate crisis.
Right.
But the migrations that are happening because of the changing climate are not the crisis, right? So that part is adaptive. I mean, so I think what has happened over time is that we've really focused on the most conspicuous migrations, and we've seen only the most disruptive effects. We haven't incorporated in our conventional ideas about migration the whole story of migration. And I think when you look at this whole story of migration, you see that migration, the benefits outweigh the costs, which is why it's been so adaptive for all of these species over time. We've evolved to migrate because it's how we respond to environmental change. It's how we have survived a changing planet. So, the planet's been dynamic from day one. It's not something new. The pace is new right now, right? And the reason of the change is new. But the actual fact of change is not new at all. And I think when you look at what migration really means in our history and in nature, it becomes clear that it is an adaptation. It's something that we should encourage, especially in this moment when there's so much disruptive environmental change happening. We should be facilitating and managing these movements. Of course, they have disruptive effects. I do not dispute that at all. They have a lot of disruptive effects, but they also have benefits, and we can manage it in a way to say, let's maximize the benefits and minimize the disruptions.
So we shouldn't be afraid of the migrants that are coming from Afghanistan or Syria or India or Pakistan, but manage that migration. Is that correct?
Exactly. I mean, I think we have this idea of migration as a faucet that we can turn off and on ourselves. It's something that we can control. We think of it as marginal, as exceptional, as driven by catastrophe, and as having almost entirely negative effects. So when we think of migration as a burden and something we can control, then we make policy like, okay, let's close the borders. We don't want these people. Or let some of them in if they can do jobs that we want them to do. But once they outlive their usefulness, kick them out again. So that thinking about migration, I think, is what we need to re-examine, to look at migration as not something that we can turn off and on, not something that we can pull up the ladders and say, no, it's not happening to us, but as a reality that is happening all the time, that is part of our adaptive response, is part of our evolution, is part of our human condition to move around. And then we can manage that, the way we manage all the other disruptive things that we recognize are useful. Right?
But is that a human condition to move? I mean, why do we want to move at all? Why is it so much nicer to just stay in your cave and, with a fire around you and your kids and your grandkids?
I mean, I don't think we know the answer to that question, but the fact is we left Africa. There was no food shortage. We hadn't run out of space. Life was fairly good there. It still is, but we left, and we did it more than once. And then we went into the heights of the Tibetan Plateau. We didn't just do that once either, and it wasn't by accident. Multiple waves during ancient times when it was very difficult. We left Asia in canoes and paddled out into the featureless ocean, not knowing what was there, not just once in ancient times, but multiple times to populate Polynesia. So this migratory instinct is very deep within us, I think.
Mm-hmm. And, that reminds me of these excavations that are being carried out in the Indus Valley civilization, which is across India and Pakistan. And of course, the border in 1947 doesn't recognize, ancient civilizations don't recognize contemporary borders. So to see a skeleton from a place called Rakhigari, which is, less than, perhaps 100 kilometers from Delhi, brings to you the drama of this civilization that existed a few thousand years ago, and how people must have lived and migrated and walked and just breathed. So that's a fascinating story, and it reminds me about this story is a reminder from your book.
Yeah, and I think we're recovering a lot of that ancient history now through advances in things like genetic technology. Also, we've been putting together. For a long time, the idea was that ancient people, we sort of walked out of Africa, populated all the continents, and then just stayed still. For millennia until this modern era of migration when we have fast ships and planes and trains and things like that. But what geneticists and paleogeneticists in particular are finding now is that they're able to extract DNA from ancient remains. And that used to be very difficult, but they figured out a way to do it by looking in certain parts of these remains to get a lot of the DNA intact from, these very ancient human remains that we have all scattered all over the planet. And from that, they can reconstruct the history of ancient migrations between the out of Africa dispersal and the modern era. And it turns out that, that all of those movements were just as complicated and fluid and, counterintuitive as the movements that we see today. So we've been moving all along. We walked out of Africa. We didn't stay still. We didn't get to North America and then stay there for millennia. People from North America walked back into Asia. They went back into Europe. People from Asia walked back into Africa, back out to Europe, it was just this jumble of migration and movements the same way that we see today.
So, the burden of your book is about how we should not be driven by fear, and that people will move from one place to another, or not just people, but animals and even viruses. And I do want to connect with one of your previous books called Pandemic and talk about the virus that has migrated from Wuhan in China and spread all over the world. So that's something that we are so fearful about, right? All of us.
And rightly so. The disruptive effects of microbes and animals and humans moving in new ways are very real. And I think we're living in a moment when that is, very apparent to all of us, because of course this is a microbe that emerged in one part of the world and very rapidly traveled the rest of the planet. I think we still see that underestimation of the scale of mobility with the responses of policymakers. Right after the virus emerged in Wuhan, policymakers around the world said, oh, well, we don't want that, so let's close our borders. We're not going to let Chinese people in. We're not going to let people from Wuhan into our country. And okay, good, done. And it didn't work, obviously, and I think even at that moment, when the virus had in the first weeks before Wuhan even shut down, 7 million people left that city. Because that's just the scale of movement that's always happening. It's sort of beneath our notice. We have this idea of migration and mobility as that it's something exceptional and rare, and so we can kind of control it. But in fact, there were so many people moving around already, whether it's short distance or long distance. This thing was going to get out.
Yeah, but they were moving because of the Spring Festival, right? It happened to coincide at the time.
It did, but I think there's also just a background level of mobility that hasn't been extricated out. So this wasn't like there was some huge spike in movement that explained it. I think if you look at the mobility patterns, there's people moving in and out of these places all the time. And for a microbe, it doesn't matter if the first person is only moving 10 kilometers and the next person moves 300 kilometers, you still get to travel with that person. You can jump from one to the next. So the idea that somehow we could close all our borders and not get this thing, because we could immobilize this highly mobile microbe traveling on highly mobile people. And this is not even to go into whether animals are moving it around, and we still don't know. We know that wild species carry around avian influenza, for example. There's a lot of wild species movements that also shape how diseases spread. Mm-hmm. So, the idea that the introduction of the germ is something that we can kind of repel and say, no, stop at the border, please, I think is really testament to how we have underestimated our own mobility and the mobility of the planet more generally.
Right. So, another part of the pandemic of your book that I read, which was really fascinating, was how the Chinese have started eating all these exotic foods. And perhaps you say that's one of the reasons why, viruses and microbes are jumping species. So not just the SARS-CoV-2 or the coronavirus, but even other viruses. But so tell us a little bit about what's happening in China. Why is there this appetite for not just pork belly, but liver, sort of all kinds of fantastically cooked or raw liver and other parts of animals?
I mean, I think it's actually not new. So that's a long tradition in China to seek out sort of wild animals to eat for special occasions and for different reasons. So that part isn't new. But I think what's happening around the planet is that humans are using up more and more wildlife habitat.
Can I interrupt you? Were you surprised by that? Did you go to China and did you see the Chinese eating?
I did. I went to China and I went to one of those so-called wet markets where they were selling all different kinds of wild animals.
What was it like?
Of course, it was illegal at the time, but it was very easy to find. It was sort of like a warehouse, and and they had jars and cages of different animals, and it was obviously family run. So there's family units who were all there, and multi-generational families who had clearly brought all these animals to this one sort of central location. I mean, it was like a market like any other. It wasn't, it was visually not, very interesting. I've seen much more vibrant markets in India, for example, or in parts of Europe than this.
Are you vegetarian? May I ask if you're vegetarian?
No, I'm an omnivore. So I'm not grossed out by the fact that they're eating these animals' flesh. I accept that as what they're doing and something I, don't necessarily frown upon or anything. But what was interesting is that, they were showing me different products they had. Like there was a jar with a cobra in it. And the way we were able to get information about this was my translator who was with me sort of started negotiating with the shop seller of well, how much is it? And she was like, well, how many people do you want to feed? You want to feed 10 people or 12 people? And she's getting different, jars of cobras.
It was like a full cobra, like a full snake.
Yes, but coiled up in a jar. In a jar of some kind of fluid. I don't know, maybe
right.
Salt water or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was sort of like, no, actually, no, I kind of backed out of it. And then the shopkeeper, realized I'm American, and she asked my my translator, so is it true that Americans eat turkeys? And she's hiding her laughter behind her hands because she thought my eating habits were disgusting, So, which is just to say, it's really all relative, right? What we decide is okay to eat is absolutely relative. And what's happening in China is you have a very big economy that's growing fast, and it's in a place where there's a lot of biodiversity. So, these spillovers are, there's sort of an underlying drivers of spillovers where you have people expanding into wildlife habitat where there's a lot of different kinds of wildlife, and that facilitates the microbes in their bodies coming over into our bodies. And it's not just through eating them and marketing them. If we cut down, if we pave over wildlife habitat, we bring our farms, we bring our towns and cities into closer contact with
right.
where wild species live. And that just facilitates all kinds of interactions. It makes it easier to hunt them and eat them, sure. It also makes it easier to trade in them. It also makes it easier to have just, casual encounters with them. And it doesn't take much for a casual encounter of any kind to allow the microbes in the animals' bodies to come into our bodies. And a good example of that is in the Ebola outbreak in 2014 in West Africa. It was one kid, a 2-year-old kid, who was playing near a tree where bats were roost. He probably got some bat poo or bat saliva on his hand and put his hand in his mouth. That was all it took, and 11,000 people died, or 14,000 people died in that outbreak.
Yeah. So coming back to the migration book, and this is my last question, a lot of leaders today, sort of very nationalist leaders, including yours and mine, Donald Trump and Prime Minister Modi, are erecting walls to keep people out. Trump has wanted to build a wall to keep Mexicans out. In India and Pakistan have virtually no contact with each other, although we're neighbors. So what would you say to them?
I mean, I think that was a huge motivation in writing this book. Trump had not won he had not won the presidency yet, but Brexit had happened. And so there already was this wave of sort of populist, right-wing populist leaders coming into power and saying, let's close down all the borders. And, you know, the EU borders were getting closed. And then Britain was saying, well, we don't even want to be part of this whole open border thing anymore, you know, and then that just fell like dominoes across the planet, you know, and in India and the US and Poland and, you know, and Brazil, like all over the place. So, you know, I think the underlying idea that they are promoting is that migration is something that we can end. If we don't want it, we can end it. And I think it's very much a reaction to the fact that we do have to move right now. And we are moving more right now, you know, and so we're having this very fearful response of, wait, hang on a second, you know, we don't want this. And I think, you know, in part it's because we're only looking at the most conspicuous aspects of migration, and we make migration conspicuous through our policies. So when we say, okay, you cannot cross the Mediterranean safely, we are not going to send any rescue boats for you. We're not going to let you even apply for asylum in this country or that country. We're going to close these gates to you. We make migration more conspicuous then, because of course people continue to try to migrate because they must, they have to, right? But then they come up against the wall. And so then they're stuck in refugee camps, or they're, you know, detained at the border, or they're, you know, drowning in the sea. And that's what grabs headlines. So through our policies, we create the spectacle of migration as a catastrophe. And then all of our policy making follows from that. Right. So it's really this self-fulfilling prophecy of, you know, the more walls we erect, the more migration becomes a crisis, the more walls we want to erect. And I think that's sort of the cycle that we're heading into right now. And so this book is trying to argue that we need a new way to think about migration, to have a more good faith conversation about how do we want to live on this planet that is changing so rapidly? You know, how do we want to protect biodiversity and cultural diversity and human diversity? I mean, these things are important. And if we value that, then we need a new way of looking at how people and animals move around the planet.
Right. Thank you so much, Sonia Shah. Thank you for your time. I don't have a copy of the book, like I said, but all those watching the show. Sonia, can you show us the book again? Yeah, so
yes,
all those,
it will be out.
It'll be out in Delhi and elsewhere in the country, in India, very soon. It's been published by Bloomsbury, so all of you watching this, please do go buy the book. And Sonia, I just wanted, we also have this video book review at ThePrint, and we call it Page Turner. So do subscribe to our YouTube channel, read us, and you know, tell your friends about us at ThePrint. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.